everybody, and welcome back to another week in review. This time it's a little bit late, and I do apologize for that. However, I was on vacation, so I have something of an excuse. This week in review is brought to you by a commenter named Chicken Nuggies, a commenter truly after my own heart, who suggested I play 358th Strelkovy and 4th Munte Romanian Division. A quick note on further comments, I am still adding them to the end of my list, and I will get to them when I get to them. However, because of the increase in volume of these comments, I am a bit backlogged, so don't be surprised if it takes me a couple weeks to get to your suggestion. All that aside, let's give them a look and see what I ended up doing throughout the week with these two divisions. I would like to say right off the bat that both of these divisions are in their own way good, however, they are just worse versions of other divisions that already exist. 358th Strelkovy, for example, is just a worse version of 184th Strelkovy. And 4th Munte is kind of just a worse version of the other two Romanian divisions. So bear that in mind as we go along, as it's kind of going to inform a lot of my negative criticisms toward these decks, and a lot of these negative criticisms are solved by those other divisions. But without further ado, let's jump right into my first iteration of 358th Strelkovy. I jumped right into designing this division by bringing in two cards of the Snappery, one in Phase A and one in Phase B. However, I did bring them in the DZHIP, anticipating I would be bringing in the PTRS teams or Ognamachiki if they got them, but I ended up not doing that, and then I didn't go back to edit it, so it was kind of a faux pas on my... In the infantry tab, I went with a Phase A card of the Chernopajachniki that come in at an absurd 18 per card. A Phase A card of the Group of Flamers, I dare not even try to pronounce that second word, and a Phase A card of the Strelky SVT. In Phase B, I brought in the second card of Chernopajachniki, coming in at a still absurd 27 per, a Phase B Strelky Komrodi, and a Phase B Group of Flamers again. Lastly, in Phase C, I brought in a card of the Strelky DP, coming in at 27 per card, just to help me finish out with a big flourish of spam coming the end of a game. I will get into things I liked and didn't like about each unit once I get to the end of the week. So until then, just hold tight and I'll go over what I brought in and kind of my thinking as to why I brought it in. In my tank tab, I brought in a Phase A card of the T26E, as this was the only phase they were available in, a Phase A card of the T60s, and a Phase B card of the T3476s. The T26 at 15 points has got to be one of the most cost-efficient tanks and units in the game, and the T60 sports a 20mm cannon, so those are just great for clearing out infantry that would otherwise be stubborn to tank fire. I should hope I don't have to explain why I brought in the T3476, but in case you're wondering, it's because it's the heaviest tank I had access to in this tab, and it's just a decent tank all around. 55 points is a bit pricey for what it was doing for me, but all in all, it worked out. In my support tab, I brought in a Phase A card of Maxims, my least favorite of any Russian unit in the game, and a Phase A Combat. In Phase B, I brought in the 52P TAC 353 76.2mm infantry gun, and a Phase B card of the Studebaker Snabs. In Phase B, I rounded it all out with more supplies, though these were kind of superfluous, so don't be surprised when they're dropped by the end of the week. The Maxims ended up doing an alright job, I suppose, however, they are the weakest of all the machine guns in my opinion. That said, they're the only option for machine guns in this tab in this deck, so kind of take them or leave them. As always, the 30.76.2mm infantry guns overperformed and were just excellent all around, so I can't really complain about them at all. In the anti-tank tab, I brought in a Phase A card of the M42 45mm, a Phase A card of the ISU 122S, Phase B 122s, and Phase C 122s. I figured being that this deck only got the one card of the ISU 122S, really the only unit that sets it apart from 180th, I might as well use that as my Vanguard anti-tank unit and try to take advantage of that early extra accuracy and punish enemy Panthers and Tigers. For the most part this worked, but I'm going to say something fairly controversial about this division. I think the 122s are probably the weakest part of this division. Everything else really performs well, and then the 122 fails to block shots from any other tank that it's supposed to be able to kill, and that leads to a lot of frustration in using it. I know that the obvious answer to that is just use it as an ambush unit or use them in numbers or use something to tank for them and then use these to fire at them, but it's a little bit too much micromanaging for a unit that costs 120 to 130 points. All that aside, I digress. The unit ended up performing quite well, but it has its drawbacks. In the gigantic anti-air tab, I brought in one card of Phase B M17. The end. Honestly, this division doesn't have any anti-aircraft weapons in it. I know the M17 is great at killing aircraft, however, I was using it to supplement the fact that I was bringing in the Maxims in the support tab and mow down hordes of infantry. For the most part, I found that once you dissuaded 1 or 2 bombing runs with about 3 of these stacked up behind your 122s, then the enemy stopped using planes. These things dissuade those bombing runs quite efficiently, so enemies kind of take note of that and begin shelling you indiscriminately instead. So in order to get my money's worth out of these units, I started using them as infantry support, and they really excel at killing 20-point infantry very, very quickly, so there's that. In the artillery tab, I tried to, get good by bringing in the 120mm mortars in Phase A, however, I again didn't use these too much. I also brought in a Phase A card of the 122 M30s, and the 122 M30s in the supply truck just to round out my supplies. I was down 2 trucks from my other artillery pick, so I figured why not. In Phase B, I brought in the ML20 152mm in the supply trucks, and in Phase C, I brought in the Morzer 210mm in the supply trucks. Now, something you could do is drop the Morzers entirely from this division, as even without the supply trucks, they're gratuitously expensive. And for 150 to 190 points, you could probably just bring in enough units to overwhelm whatever it was you were going to shell and end up with more front line to show for it. But I digress. I ended up using these guys only once throughout the week, and even then, they were big boom, but not very effective. In the air tab, I brought in my only anti-aircraft weapon, the Yak-7B at 2 stars, and I could have been persuaded to bring this in at a lower veterancy to get more of them, or perhaps later to get more of them, because it really did perform well. I love bringing in ASF at 2 stars because it does really change how they perform. And on top of that, the Yak-7B is quite quick and quite agile already, so it's already a decent plane to bring in to kill enemy aircraft. However, being that I was only bringing in the one of them, it kind of went down early a lot, and I just was stuck with no anti-aircraft capability for the rest of the game. In Phase A also, I brought in the IL-2M3 just to get bombs on the field. I oftentimes didn't end up using this in Phase A, being that it's kind of expensive and I had enough Chernopojachniki that I could patch any hole with them instead of with an aircraft, but when I did, they performed well. The IL-2 is practically invulnerable and oftentimes drops its munitions without being stunned, even when multiple guns are firing at it. In Phases B and C, I brought in a no-star card of the Yak-7B anti-tank variant, and these actually performed a lot better than I thought they were going to. Oftentimes I find that I'm using the PE-2s or much heavier rocket planes, and I kind of eschew using these because they're not quite as damaging. However, because of this, and because of the speed at which they're able to deliver those munitions, these kind of overperform for their point value, so I really do recommend these, especially when fighting things like Panthers at side armor, or if you just want to nuke out a King Tiger really quickly. In Phase C, I brought in 12 Tu-2Ss. 4 of them have a different munitions, bringing in the 1,000 kilogram bomb, but all of these do exactly the same thing. They obliterate one area of the map with maximum efficiency, and they oftentimes drop their munitions regardless of aircraft or anti-aircraft weapons. 2 things about the Tu-2Ss. I cannot find a way to complain about the Tu-2S or the PE-2 or any of the heavy bombers that are available in this tab in countless decks across either side. However, I long for the day that I don't have to bring in 3 cards of bombers just to be competitive in the late game should things progress past Phase C for any length of time. I'm of the mind that I think aircraft should be used to patch small holes and not carry an entire deployment, and in the current meta of the game, at least in team games, enough bombers will carry anything. Doesn't matter if you have 1 infantry squad on the map, if you have enough bombers, you can just solve the entire enemy battalion. The only thing that rivals this is the incalculable amount of off-map that you're liable to see, but I digress. Moving on to my deck at the end of the week, you'll see that I brought the Snappery in the correct transport and also brought in a T-70 Razvedka in Phase A at no stars. This was kind of there to supplement my pushes through forests, as the T-60 oftentimes found itself losing to units that it shouldn't have lost to. At one point, I had the T-60s fighting enemy Romanian recon vehicles and just losing to them for no apparent reason, so I ended up bringing the T-70s and they did that job much, much better. The T-60s were still incredibly useful in killing infantry, but for the life of them cannot kill vehicles. The infantry tab didn't see terribly much changed. All I did was drop the Phase B card of Strelkovy Komrody, as I found I needed radios more than I needed 8 commanders, so I dropped them and brought in the artillery command instead, but we'll get to that later. Where this deck really shines is cheap infantry that you can just throw out at horrific rates. I was able to take several cities throughout the week of playing this division just through sheer number of Chernopojachniki that I was able to summon in. Granted, I never did overwhelmingly positive with this division, being that it relies a lot on the, shall we say, typical Soviet strategy of sending less than armed folk up to fight more than armed folk, just in greater numbers. I was treating my Flamers and my Strelky as kind of my elite infantry that I would send forward to hold the ground that my Cherno were able to roll through like the oozing mass of flesh that they were. For the most part, I really liked the Flamers that this division got access to. However, something that I really hate about Russian Flamers is they oftentimes bring in some sort of a long-ranged weapon that they just fire worthlessly if you forget to micro them. At one point, some of my Flamers had engaged a squad of Sturmschützen on their way into a forest at about 200 meters out, and the Sturmschützen just vacuumed them off the map without taking a single loss because most of the Flamers' weapons weren't in range. Granted, this is just failed micro on my part, but it's kind of silly that close-ranged units should bring in a long-ranged weapon just to give themselves away if you're newer to the game or you forget to micro them. The tank tab saw no changes, as it is perfect as all things should be. The T-34s are amazing at just holding down T-34 shaped things in the mid-game, and the T-60s and T-26s are just fantastic spam tanks. The support tab almost saw the addition of one more Maxim. In fact, I played one game with one more Maxim in it instead of the Studebaker Snab, but thank God I got rid of it because it's kind of pointless still. Other than me dropping the Phase C supply trucks, this tab saw no change. In the anti-tank tab, I picked up a card of the Ziz-2s in Phase B. At a 3-point slot, it's kind of really pricey, but I found that oftentimes I was struggling because of my lack of anti-tank hidden weapons, instead of the giant bulky ISU 122s that poked their heads out and just ended up dying to enemy Tigers or such not. The anti-air tab saw absolutely no change, stay perfect M17. The artillery tab probably saw the most change throughout the week, as I dropped a card of the M30 122s to Phase B. I also picked up the Phase B artillery commander that I talked about earlier to help me get the radios on target for the 152s, and I ended up dropping a card of the mortars, as I just wasn't using them, and when I was using them, I was just using them incorrectly, so it's just better that I don't bring them in all day. The air tab was once again perfect. The only thing that I could change about this air tab is, as I said in the earlier version of this deck, the Yak-7B could do to be brought to a lower veterancy or perhaps a later phase, as these guys really are more anti-aircraft capability. But this is the deck that I ended up settling on. I could see this deck doing very well as either a Vanguard or a Maverick deployment type, just because of the amount of stuff that you can bring in phases A and B as opposed to other divisions. Even at a balanced deployment, I found that I was able to spam just twice as many units, oftentimes more than that, than any Axis player that I might be fighting. While Axis units might be more effective per point, the Russian units in this division especially are much more efficient per point, oftentimes overperforming their point value as opposed to the Axis units. The Chernopojachniki, even if they didn't have weapons, I would bring in, as just that many bullet sponges is truly something. These guys just kind of march forward, get shot at a bunch, fall back, march forward, so on and so forth, until they either achieve their objective or all die. What's great about that is it forces the enemy to try and figure out what to do against this horde of Cherno that's kind of just pouring over one another like a War Z zombie pact. While that's happening, you have an absurd amount of snipers, Maxims, and other support units that are just pouring down fire onto enemy units and just taking them out while the Cherno tank all the shots. I found that the 122S, while being the huge selling point of this division, was kind of a disappointment for me. It packs the better gun, and because of this, more accuracy than the typical 122, but other than that, there's no change between the units. It doesn't have additional armor, it doesn't have additional damage, even though that wouldn't matter if it did, as they already do 12 damage, and it doesn't have additional penetration. The extra accuracy is nice, and especially when buffed up to 2 stars, these units are kind of deadly. On top of this, I slightly misspoke. It does have a faster fire rate because of the better gun, but again, that's not really going to change the outcome of an engagement, especially being that it went from 3 rounds per minute to 4. Being that most Axis tanks that you'd be using this against are firing at nearly double that, it kind of doesn't really make a difference if they fire at 3, 4, or even 5. They do just fine against Panthers or things firing light caliber weapons, but once they go up against 88s, all bets are off, and I almost bet on the Tigers winning in an engagement at 2 kilometers against these guys. While the 122 will kill the Tigers in a single hit, where it struggles is the fact that the Tiger will hit more often, penetrate more often due to the 122 having less armor, and just overall fire more often due to a higher fire rate. Leaving these guys engaged with enemy tanks is either intentional suicide or negligence. There's just no in between on those. They just can't take more than 1 shot from any one vehicle, and so it's just not worth leaving them engaged while they're reloading. And so because of this, the extra fire rate really doesn't matter. If you're using these things properly, you're only taking engagements at 2 kilometers against enemy heavy tanks. You're only moving into range to fire, and then you're backing up out of range once they've fired, so it doesn't matter how they reload at that point. That said, the 122s did well enough, however, I just wish they were a little bit better for the point cost. At 120 points, these units are purportedly as good as Tigers, and I can tell you for a fact that that is just absolutely false. All that said, they have their uses, and I can't disparage them all the way. They kill Panthers just almost immediately, and are in almost no danger when fighting against Panthers. They do pack a better gun than most units in the game, able to take out enemy tanks in a single shot regardless of the class of enemy tank. Luckily this week I haven't seen many King Tiger divisions, but anytime that I did, I just wouldn't even bring these in. There's just no point. Even in tickling distance, these things only have a 50% chance to penetrate the Tiger 2H from front armor, and so it's almost worth more to just bring in a TU-2S instead. That's kind of my disappointment with where bombers are at right now. The ISU-122 was designed to kill tanks and is infinitely worse at killing tanks than a TU-2S is. Granted, that's unfair because the TU-2S has a long reload time, is off the map instead of on the map, doesn't hold front lines, and can be dissuaded by enemy anti-aircraft weapons. However, if you drop 4,000 kilograms of bombs on top of a Tiger 2H, that thing is definitely gone. Whereas if you fire 4 times with a 122S at tickling distance at a Tiger 2H, you might kill it. Between the thing's abysmal accuracy and its inability to penetrate even while touching the enemy vehicle, this thing is likely to miss once, bounce once, penetrate maybe 1 time out of those last 2 shots, and so it kind of really dissuades you from using units in their intended role. All that aside, I did enjoy playing this deck a lot. I just wish it was more like 184th. Where this deck really falls apart is its lack of anti-aircraft capabilities, and 184th is rolling in AA guns. They get access to a similar complement of infantry, a similar complement of tanks, being that they trade out the T-60s and T-26s for the M5Ls, which might as well be the same tank as the T-26, just a bit more expensive, and also have a bigger support tab and more sniper cards available to them. It's just a better version of this deck, and that's truly unfortunate because I really want this deck to be good on its own merits. The one standout unit in this division, being the 122S, is good, but it's not great enough to justify the difference between the 2 divisions, and so I kind of have to say that this deck is very difficult to play comparatively to other divisions on the Russian team. All in all though, if you're looking for just a herd of Cherno that you can pour into a city and slowly overwhelm someone as they panic under the weight of that zombie horde of Russian partisans, then this is the deck for you. Moving on to 4th Munte on the Axis side, and I only had 1 iteration of this division, so I'll be discussing it as I go along. On top of that, this is a division I've had since the release of the Romanian patch, so I can't really give you the first iteration of this division as I no longer have access to it, but I can give you this iteration of it. In the Recon tab, I brought in a Phase A card and a Phase C card of the Vanatari I dare not even try to pronounce the last word sniper units that come with 2 snipers and are absolutely insane. While you also get access to more snipers in this tab, I found that these 2 cards were oftentimes enough, and 2 snipers on a herd of infantry is just unheard of and ridiculously effective. On top of this, I brought in a Phase B card of the SDKFZ 250/9 Recon vehicles with the 20mm cannons, and I could be persuaded to bring these in Phase A as I think they'd be more effective there, but these guys are just ridiculously good no matter what phase you bring them in. In the infantry tab, I have a Phase A card of the Recruity because I'd be absolutely ridiculous not to. 15 points, they come with 9 per squad, they're just fantastic, you can flood them forth, kind of like the Cherno from the earlier division, if not quite as numerous. I also have a Phase A card of the Detonuti, which are kind of an oxymoronic unit. They sport Molotovs at a 100 meter range and then 15 Mazins. So it's a weird unit, but you know what? They oftentimes overperform in either role, so I bring them in. I also bring in the Vanatari de Munte, which are practically just Panzer Grenadier with 2 MG42s, and these guys are fantastic. I don't know why I skip over bringing them in my opening deployment oftentimes, but when I do bring them in, they always overperform. I also bring in a Phase A and B card of the LTVMs. These guys are everything that you'll ever need in a commander unit. They have a leadership stat, they have a radio stat, they have a Panzerschreck, they have a sniper rifle. It literally doesn't matter what else they have, but they have other weapons on top of that. If you're not bringing these in and you're playing Munte, then you're just not playing the game correctly. These things are absolutely fantastic. They kill enemy tanks, they kill enemy infantry, they support your troops, they give you a radio, they give you leadership. It's absolutely perfect as a unit. I also bring in a Phase B card of the infantry. I dare not even try to pronounce whatever the Romanian word is, just 20-point spam infantry, and a Phase B card of the Pioneering Assault. These ridiculous little beasts bring in one of the better submachine guns in the game in the Orita, and just flame everything to death at close range. I have yet to find a Russian unit other than the Morskaya Auto that will stand up to these guys in 100 meter range. To round it all out, in Phase C, I bring in another card of the Detonuti and another card of the Vanatari de Munte. Just kind of round it all out, give me that extra spam, and these units are all fantastic. This is one of the better infantry tabs in the game, in my opinion, as it combines these sort of cheap, interesting niche units with these overarching great units such as the Vanatari de Munte that are just excelling at everything. In the tank tab, I bring in a Phase A card of the R35s. 20-point tanks, 8 per card, 1-star veterancy. I can't see a downside to these guys. In Phase B and C, I bring in a card of the Panzer IV-H, and I could be persuaded to bring these in at 1 star as you may lose a few of them, but I bring them in at no stars just to get the extra. These guys mainly exist to help me fight enemy Shermans or enemy medium tanks other than Shermans that I might be going up against at any given time. In the support tab, I bring in a card of the Phase A Flamers on the motorbikes. Fairly standard pick. I bring them in any division that has access to them, as they're oftentimes the first to the fronts and will overperform their point value most of the time. I also bring in a Phase A card of the Breda AC 47mm anti-tank/anti-infantry gun. These things are great, they fire faster than sin, and they'll kill enemy tanks just as efficiently as they'll kill enemy infantry, so they're fantastic units. The VM Commandant, which again fairly standard. I bring in a Phase B card of the Flampanzer B2, just to have something to bring in Phase B that will get there roughly around 35 minutes later due to the speed. But when it does get there, it will die immediately to enemy medium tanks. While that's mostly kidding, these guys aren't great, but at 35 points, I struggle to not bring them in. They're good enough to bring in at 35 points, but if they were any more expensive, I think I'd skip them in favor of literally any other unit. I also bring in a Phase B card of supplies, as you kind of have to. In the anti-tank tab, I bring in the PAK 9738 AC 75mm gun in Phase A that I always forget has heat rounds that can be fired, penetrate up to 100mm at any range, and even though I know this as a fact right now, I will still skip bringing them in favor of another gun and really be disappointed by that other gun. I also bring in a Phase A card of the Pak 38 AC 50mm, as these are just fantastic. They'll kill whatever you set them against. Efficient shot, these bastards, and they'll kill IS-2s. They don't care. They're great units. Another huge example of Romanian versatility is the Venatori de Care, which bring in a fairly large squad with a Panzerschreck and an HE grenade that they can use at close range. Another just fantastic unit. These guys will come in, they'll kill enemy infantry, they'll kill enemy tanks. They'll be frontline infantry if you want them to be, if you're crazy, that is, but they're just fantastic. I would advise bringing these in whenever you can in any division that gets access to them. They're just fantastic units. In Phase B, I also rounded out with a Pak 40 75mm to help me deal with the heavy tanks that I sometimes see in this division. While I'm not likely to fight on fronts that's going to see a lot of IS-2s or things like that, sometimes things go a little off the rails and I have to end up using these to kill enemy Tigers, enemy IS-2s, whatever it might be. In the AA tab, I bring in a Phase A card of the 20mm Flak 38s that come in the Hotchkiss transport. While these are expensive, they give you 2 anti-infantry guns for the price of 1, and sometimes they'll fire at planes, which is nice. In Phase B, I bring in a card of the Mobilwagens at no star veterancy. These guys are great. Pak 43 on treads, I have literally no complaints about these units. And in Phase C, I round it all out with the Vickers 75mm dual purpose gun, and these guys kind of act as late game anti-tank guns for me that can defend themselves from aircraft more than they do anti-aircraft weapons, but to each their own. Next, we'll hop into the artillery tab, which is going to vastly upset somebody because I have a 1-point slot available, and I have no intention of filling it. I have a Phase A card of the 100mm artillery that I was using as kind of mortars, and they're cheaper than mortars in most instances, so that's great. In Phase B, I bring in the 105s, again, just to kind of use as howitzers and what. Oftentimes, I ended up just using these to suppress enemy anti-aircraft weapons to use my massive horde of bombers, but I digress. In Phase C, I also round out my command structure by bringing in the artillery commanders. These guys, again, just grabbing me that extra radio coverage for those earlier units and allowing me to get veterancy onto my tanks oftentimes, or sometimes my infantry, but most of the time I was just using these for the radio. In the air tab, I bring in a Phase A and Phase B card of the HS-129 B-Tech 2/R2 planes. These are terrible, I'm going to be honest with you. They're good enough if you're able to get side armor on an enemy IS-2 or something like that. However, in order to get side armor on them, you have to circumvent a lot of stuff, and being that they travel so slowly, they're oftentimes just going to go down before they get there. They're not incredibly resilient, not incredibly agile. An enemy plane sent in about an hour after they came in will probably kill them before they fire any munitions, and oftentimes they'll just line up in a stupid way that's going to fire an enemy tank at the front armor, especially if the enemy is paying attention. All that said, they're the best anti-tank option that you're going to get access to in this division, especially that early on, so I bring them in just to kind of bet the farm on those outrageous times that they actually get the kill. In Phase B, I also bring in the PZL P.37B bombers, and in Phase C, I bring in the JRS Tech 79 and more of the P.37Bs. I don't know the munitions on all of these, I just know if you select enough of them and you right-click on an area, that area ceases to exist, and that's all I need to know. So I know as I've gone through this division, I've said a lot of positive things about it, especially the versatility of units, and at the very beginning of this video, oxymoronically, I've said that this is the weakest of all the Romanian divisions. What I mean by this is it lacks access to the 75mm anti-tank gun that makes Romania a decent and playable division in team games as it is. While this division is perfectly playable, and I can't say that it's the worst division on the Axis side by any means, it is not great for team games. When last I had checked, I thought this division was actually one of the higher rated ones in the 1v1 ranking list, however I might be mistaken on that, so don't quote me on it. This is likely due to its massive amount of versatility. Each unit that you bring in has more than one use, and this is across most all of the tabs. Your recon tab, for example, sports 2 sniper rifles that can be used as infantry support or just as standard recon. In the infantry tab, you have access to the Detonuti, which can either be used as mid-ranged engagers with their 15 Mazins or as close-ranged engagers with their Molotov cocktail. Once again, with the LT.VM, these guys have Panzerschreck, sniper rifles, and regular weapons, and they're a leader. So each unit that you bring in is performing more than one role, and that probably really sets them apart in 1v1s. However, where this versatility kind of comes to a head is in team games, it struggles to do any specialized task. If you're up against a dedicated infantry division, oftentimes these guys aren't going to cut it against that. If you're up against a tank division, you're going to be really struggling through a lot of the game. The Pak 38 and Pak 40 are excellent options to kill these enemy tanks, but if you're not putting them in correct ambush locations, or due to their limited availability, you're not using them to their fullest potential, you're going to just lose to these things. Honestly, the hardest counter that I've seen to this division is 3rd US Armored, as it will just blow through you with herds and herds of Shermans that you're almost incapable to stop if you're not ready for them ahead of time. While I'm saying all that though, this division is my favorite of the Romanian divisions to play. It's just got so many fun units in it that are interesting to use, and if you can pay attention to their names, you can actually use them to their fullest. On top of this, it gets access to the requisite 1,050 bombers that are capable of removing enemies from the map in large enough numbers, so if all else fails, you can just delete portions of the enemy team until it's time for the game to end. Another great part about this division, though it is kind of overshadowed by the cavalry division of Romania also, is the amount of sniper rifles that you have access to. It's kind of silly watching a line from 4th Munte open up on enemy advancing infantry. It's just like 7 or 8 sniper rifles of normal units just bearing down on them. And so that's another point in the versatility column, just in the amount of things that you have access to that perform more than one purpose. Because of all this, I would rate this deck as, again, moderately difficult to play, just because of the amount of micromanaging that you have to do in order to perform as well as some other divisions. Either way, that's going to do it for this week in review of 358 Strelkovy and 4th Munte. Next week, it's going to be 14th Infantry on the Axis side, as well as 7th Mechanized on the Allies side. Thank you guys for watching, and as always, I hope you've learned something.